Section 39 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Inglesant, A Romance by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Chapter 25, Part 2. It must not be supposed, however, that he was altogether absorbed in such thoughts or such pursuits. To him, as to all the other inhabitants of Rome, each in his own degree and station, the twofold aspect of existence in the strange papal city claimed his alternate regard, and divided his life and his intellect. The society of Rome, at one moment devout, the next philosophic, the next antiquarian, artistic, pleasure-seeking, imparted to all its members some tincture of its Protean character. The existence of all was coloured by the many-sided prism through which the light of every day's experience was seen. Inglesant's acquaintance with the cardinal introduced him at once to all the different coteries, and procured him the advantage of a companion who exerted a strong and cultivated mind to exhibit each subject in its completest and most fascinating aspect. Accompanied by the cardinal, and with one or other of the literati of Rome, each in his turn a master of the peculiar study to which the day was devoted, Inglesant wandered day after day through all the wonderful city, through the palaces, ruins, museums, and galleries. He stood among the throng of statues, that strange maze of antique life, which some enchanter's wand seemed suddenly to have frozen into marble in the midst of its intricate dance, yet so frozen as to retain by some mysterious art the warm and breathing life. He saw the men of the old buried centuries, of the magic and romantic existence when the world was young, the beautiful gods with their white wands, the grave senators and stately kings, the fauns and satyrs that dwelt in the untrodden woods, the pastoral flute-players, whose airs yet linger within the peasants' reeds, the slaves and craftsmen of old Rome, with all their postures, dress, and bearing, as they walked those inlaid pavements buried deep beneath the soil, whose mosaic figures every now and then are opened to the faded life of to-day. Nor less entrancing were those quaint fancies upon the classic tombs, which showed in what manner the old pagan looked out into the spacious ether and confronted death. A child playing with a comic mask, bacchanals and wreaths of flowers, hunting parties and battles, images of life, of feasting and desire, and finally the inverted torch, the fleeting seasons ended, and the actor's part laid down. Still existing as a background to this phantom life was the stage on which it had walked, the ruined splendour of Rome, in its setting of blue sky and green foliage, of ivy and creeping plants, of laurels and ilex, enfolded in a soft ethereal radiance that created everywhere a garden of romance. "Nothing delights and entertains me so much in this country," said Inglesant one day to a gentleman with whom he was walking, "as the contrasts which present themselves on every hand. The peasant's hut built in the ruins of a palace, the most exquisite carving supporting its tottering roof, cattle drinking out of an emperor's tomb, a theatre built in a mausoleum, and pantomime airs, and the plaudite heard amid the awful silence of the grave. Here a Christ, ghastly naked on a cross; there a charming God, a tender harmony of form and life, triumphal arches sunk in the ruins not of their own only, but of successive ages, monuments far more of decay and death than of glory or fame. Corinthian columns canopied with briars, ivy, and wild vine, the delicate acanthus wreaths stained by noisome weeds. The thoughts that arise from the sight of these contrasts are pleasing, though melancholy, such ideas, sentiments, and feelings as arise in the mind and in the heart at the foot of antique columns, before triumphal arches, in the depths of ruined tombs, and on mossy banks of fountains. But there are other contrasts which bring no such soothing thoughts with them, nothing but what may almost be called despair. Profusion of magnificence and wealth side by side with the utmost wretchedness, Christ's altar blazing with jewels and marble, misery indescribable around. Luxury and enjoyment and fine clothes almost hustled by rags and sores and filth. Amid the lesson of past ages written on every ruined column and shattered wall, what a distance still exists between the poor and the rich! Should the poor man wish to overpass it, he is driven back at once into his original wretchedness, or condemned more mercifully to death, while every ruined column and obelisk cries aloud, "Let everything that creeps console itself, for everything that is elevated falls." "We Romans," said the gentleman, "preserve our ruins as beggars keep open their sores. They are preserved not always from taste, nor from a respect of antiquity, but sometimes from mere avarice, for they attract from every corner of the world that crowd of strangers whose curiosity has long furnished a maintenance to 3/4 of Italy. But you were speaking of the charming gods of the ancients. We are not inferior to them. Have you seen the Apollo of Bernini pursuing Daphne in the Borghese Palace? His hair waves in the wind. You hear the entreaties of the god." "Yes, I have seen it," said Inglesant. "It is another of those wonderful contrasts with which Rome abounds. We are Catholic and pagan at the same time." "It is true," said the other. "Nevertheless, in the centre of the blood-stained Colosseo stands a crucifix. The Galilean has triumphed." Inglesant stopped. They were standing before the Apollo in the Belvedere Gardens. The Inglesant took from beneath his vest a crucifix in ivory exquisitely carved, and held it beside the statue of the god. The one the noblest product of buoyant life, the proudest perfection of harmonious form, purified from all the dross of humanity, the head worthy of the god of day and of the lyre, of healing and of help, who bore in his day the selfsame name that the other bore, the great physician. The other, worn and emaciated, helpless, dying, apparently without power, forgotten by the world. "Has the Galilean triumphed? Do you prefer the Christ?" he said. The gentleman smiled. "The benign God," he said, "has doubtless many votaries even now." It is probable that the life of Rome was working its effect upon Inglesant himself. Under its influence and that of the Cardinal, his tone of thought became considerably modified. In a strange and unexpected way, in the midst of so much religion, his attention was diverted from the religious side of life, and his views of what was philosophically important underwent considerable change. He read Lucretius less, and Terence and Aristophanes more. Human life, as he saw it existing around him, became more interesting to him than theories and opinions. Life in all its forms, the Cardinal assured him, was the only study worthy of man. And though Inglesant saw that such a general assertion only encouraged the study of human thought, yet it seemed to him that it directed him to a truth which he had hitherto perhaps overlooked, and taught him to despise and condemn nothing in the common path of men in which he walked. If this were true, the more carefully he studied this common life, and the more narrowly he watched it, the more worthy it would appear of regard. The dull and narrow streets, the crowded dwellings, the base and vulgar life, the poverty and distress of the poorer classes would assume an interest unknown to him before. This life and interest, the Cardinal would say, finds its best exponent in the old pantomime and burlesque music of Italy. The real, everyday, commonplace human life, which originates absolutely among the people themselves, speaks in their own music and street airs, but when these are touched by a master's hand, it becomes revealed to us in its essence, refined and idealized, with all its human features, which from the very familiarity escape our recognition as we walk the streets. In the peculiarity of this music, its graceful delicacy and lively frolic and grotesqueness, I think I find the most perfect presentment to the ear and heart of human life, especially as the slightest variation of time or setting reveals in the most lively of these airs depths of pathos and melodious sorrow, completing thus the analogy of life beneath the gayest phases of which lie unnoticed the saddest realities. "I've often felt," said Inglesant, "that old dance music has an inexpressible pathos. As I listen to it, I seem to be present at long past festivities, whose very haunts are swept away and forgotten. At evenings in the distant past, looked forward to as all-important, upon whose short and fleeting hours the hopes and enjoyments of a lifetime were staked, now lost in an undistinguished oblivion and dust of death. The young and the beautiful who danced to these quaint measures in a year or two had passed away, and other forms equally graceful took their place. Fancies and figures that live in sound and pass before the eyes only when evoked by such melodies float down the shadowy way and pass into the future, where the gay and brilliant hours await the young, to be followed as heretofore by pale and disappointed hopes and sad realities and the grave. "What do you mean," said the Cardinal, "by figures that live in sound?" "It seems to me," said Inglesant, "that the explanation of the power of music upon the mind is, that many things are elements which are not reckoned so, and that sound is one of them. As the air and fire are said to be peopled by fairy inhabitants, as the spiritual man lives in the element of faith, so I believe that there are creatures which live in sound. Every lovely fancy, every moment of delight, every thought and thrill of pleasure which music calls forth, or which already existing is beautified and hallowed by music, does not die. Such as these become fairy existences, spiritual creatures, shadowy but real, and of an inexpressibly delicate grace and beauty, which live in melody and float in throng before the sense whenever the harmony that gave and maintains their life exists again in sound. They are children of the earth, and yet above it. They recall the human needs and hopes from which they sprang. They have shadowy sex and rank, and diversity of bearing, as of the different actors' parts that fill the stage of life. Poverty and wants are there, but as in an allegory or morality, purified and released from suffering. The pleasures and delights of past ages thus live again in sound. The sorrows and disappointments of other days and of other men mingle with our own, and soften and subdue our hearts. Apollo and Orpheus tamed the savage beasts. Music will soften our rugged nature and kindle in us a love of our kind, and a tolerance of the petty failings and the shortcomings of men. It was not only music that fostered and encouraged in Rome an easy, tolerant philosophy. No society could be more adapted than that of the Papal City to such an end. A people whose physical wants were few and easily supplied, a single meal in such a climate, and that easily procured, sufficing for the day. A city full of strangers, festivals and shows, a conscience absolutely at rest, a community entirely set apart from politics, absolutely at one with its government by habit, by interest, and by religion, constituted a unique state and mental atmosphere in which such philosophy naturally flourished. The early hours of the day were spent in such business as was necessary for all classes to engage in, and were followed by the dinner of fruit, vegetables, fish, and a little meat. From dinner all went to sleep, which lasted till 6 o'clock in the evening. Then came an hour's trifling over the toilette. All business was at an end, and all the shops were shut. Till 3 o'clock in the morning the hours were devoted to enjoyment. Men, women, and children repaired to the public walks, to the Corso and squares, to conversation and coteries, to assemblies in arcaded and lighted gardens, to collations in taverns. Even the gravest and most serious gave themselves up to relaxation and amusement till the next day. Every evening was a festival. Every variety of character and conversation enlivened these delicious hours, these soft and starry nights. Nothing pleased Inglesant's fancy so much, or soothed his senses so completely, as this second dawn of the day, and rising to pleasure in the cool evening. Soothed and calmed by sleep, the irritated nerves were lulled into the delicious sense for which we have no name, but which we compare to flowing water and to the moistening of a parched and dusty drought. All thoughts of trouble and of business were banished by the intervening hours of forgetfulness, from which the mind, half aroused and fresh from dreamland, awoke to find itself in a world as strange and fantastic as the land of sleep which it had left. a land bathed in sunset light, overarched by rainbows, saluted by cool zephyrs, soothed by soft strains of music, delighted and amused by gay festivals, peopled by varied crowds of happy folk, many-coloured in dress and green, walks sparkling with fairy lamps, and seated at al fresco suppers before cosy taverns famous for delicious wines, where the gossip of Europe, upon which Rome looked out as from a belvedere intrigue, and the promotions of the morning were discussed. Inglesant had taken lodgings in an antique villa on the Aventine, surrounded by an uncultivated garden and by vineyards. The house was partly deserted and partly occupied by a family of priests, and he slept here when he was not at the Cardinal's palace or with other of his friends. The place was quiet and remote from the throng and noise of Rome. In the gardens were fountains in the cool shade. Frescoes and paintings had been left on the walls and in the rooms by the owner of the villa. The tinkling of convent bells sounded from the slopes of the hills, through the laurels and ilex, and across the vines. Every now and then the chanting of the priests might be heard from a small chapel at the back of the house. Inglesant awoke from his midday sleep one evening to the splash of the fountain and the scent of the fresh turned earth in the vineyard, and found his servant arranging his room for his toilette. He was to sup that evening at the Cardinal's with some of the fathers of the oratory, and he dressed, as was usual with him, even in his most distracted moods, with scrupulous care. A sedan was waiting for him, and he set out for the Cardinal's palace. It was a brilliant evening. Upon the hillsides the dark trees stood out against the golden sky. The domes and pinnacles of the churches shone in the evening light. In the quiet lanes in the neighbourhood of the Aventine, the perfume of odoriferous trees was wafted over lofty garden walls. Quiet figures flitted to and fro. A distant hum of noisy streets scarcely reached the ear, mingled with the never-ceasing bells. That morning, before he went to sleep, Inglesant had been reading the Birds of Aristophanes, with a voluminous commentary by some old scholar who had brought together a mass of various learning upon the subject of grotesque apologue, fable, and the fanciful representation of the facts and follies of human life under the characters of animals and of inanimate objects. A vast number of examples of curious pantomime and other stage characters were given, and the idea preserved throughout that by such impersonations the voices of man's existence were able to speak with clearness and pathos, and were more sure of being listened to than when they assumed the guise of a teacher or divine. Beneath a grotesque and unexpected form they conceal a gravity more sober than seriousness itself, as irony is more sincere than the solemnity which it parodies. Truth drops through a stilted gate and becomes natural and real in the midst of ludicrous and familiar events. The broad types of life's players into which the race is divided, especially the meanest, thieves, beggars, outcasts, with whom life is a reality stripped of outward show, will carry a moral and a teaching more aptly than the privileged and affected classes. Mixed with these are animals and familiar objects of household life, to which everyday use has given a character of their own. These, not in the literal repulsiveness or dullness of their monotonous existence, but abstracted as the types or emblems of the ideas associated with each one. Not a literal beggar in his dirt and loathsomeness, but poverty, freedom, helplessness, and amusing knavery personified in the part of a beggar. Not a mere article of household use in its inanimate stupidity, but every idea and association connected with the use of such articles by generations of men and women. These, and such as these, enlivened by the sparkle of genius, set forth in gay and exquisite music, and by brilliant repartee and witty dialogue, certainly cannot be far behind the very foremost delineation of human life. End of Section 39.